Well, welcome everyone to this second of our monthly TCIPG seminar series on technologies for a resilient power grid. As you know, this is hosted by the Department of Energy Center on trustworthy cyber infrastructure for the power grid. Once a month, typically the first Friday of the month, we open our meetings up. And in addition to the people we have here in the room, open this up nationally to anyone that would like to participate in these seminars. We try to get interesting folks each month to come this way. If you're online, you've at least gotten that far, so you have joined in either via our interactive or non-interactive URL. If you're on the interactive site, we'd welcome you to ask questions. And the way you do that is Michael, who is running the WebEx, you do what, Michael? You say a hands up to him, or you send a chat. Raise your hand to him and the raise hand button, and then he will patch you in so you can actually ask questions in an audio fashion. If you had any trouble with that, you can type in a question and he can stop and he can ask as well. In our first case, we had a very good response. I think over 40 people in addition to all the people we have here in this room. So we're really pleased to be able to do this. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Michael Luallen. Michael is going to speak, as you see here, on cybersecurity challenges as learned working with NERC CIP requirements. Michael is a co-founder of Encari, and he recently has left Encari, and he is with another company that he has founded called Sphere, as you see here, spelled in a very interesting way. And he's done all sorts of work, both as an instructor, author, technical consultant through Sphere and through Encari, looking at really validation and compliance issues in process control and SCADA systems. He's had a long history of companies that he's worked with. I want to give him time, so I won't say all of that. He also, I didn't know that. You're a graduate of National Technological University with a master's degree in computer science, and he has a bachelor's of science in industrial engineering here at the University of Illinois. So we're really pleased to welcome Matthew and look forward to your presentation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Bill. All right. With no further ado, I want to go and start going through content. Also, of course, feel free to ask questions for anybody that's here on site as well, not just the remote participants. Our agenda. I had a title there, Cybersecurity Challenges as Learned Working with NERC CIP, and that really is, the NERC CIP regulation is how we were able to achieve work and continue to achieve work in this space with electric utility participants. Without that regulation, there was really no cost of doing nothing, and there still is that push moving forward. However, a lot of progress has been made. There are lots of entities that have made incredible modifications to their control centers, substations, generating facilities, and there's a lot of modifications still to be made for anybody or any asset owner that didn't select any critical assets pursuant to the CIP standards to date. And that's essentially what I'm going to focus on here. Some of the items that I bring up or that I'll be addressing, we've solved. Some of them are still items that are a real challenge to the industry. Some of them are going to be challenges for the industry moving forward, not only in the electric sector, but in other industrial control system verticals. So from this point forward, what I want to call this is the CIPification of the North American power grid. And that's essentially what has been happening. But the rest of the world is interested. We've received phone calls from, well, oddly enough, Ecuador, although they're having their own challenges right now, Colombia, Europe, other Middle Eastern and Asian Pacific nations. So this is a worldwide challenge as we look at this, as we're really very, very aware of. So I'm going to go through a little bit of background as to what we've been doing with NERC CIP, Sounds like through the conversations I was already having this morning, many of you are already familiar with these standards. They've already gone through 3 iterations, version 1, 2, and 3, very rapidly. And again, that just shows you as you try to regulate to this level of strictness or a set of requirements, there has to be a lot of flexibility because there's going to be changes. Version 4 is already coming, or if it's going to be CIP 10, CIP 11, whatever it's going to be, but CIP 005 already is going through an industry ballot of modifications just for remote access because of the concern of that remote vendor network potentially allowing additional access than what they think that they are allowing during that remote connectivity. So we'll talk to that as well. I'll spend most of the time in this presentation talking about challenges. And they're massive. They're massive because in this situation, two things have, actually 3 things have crossed over specifically with the power grid. The additional automation using standard platforms, the massiveness of the system and how interconnected it is and how many different asset owners play into this environment, and the bound or unbounded access that we now have with the internet. Because whether you like it or not, everything is somewhat internet connected from a control system aspect. It's just how many firewalls, how many gateways, how much logic has been put in place to try to stop certain communication protocols. And then that goes to understanding, was it physically limited or logically limited? And if it was logically limited with the firewall, that's prone to mistakes, prone to errors, and I'll talk to that as well as we go through it. So as past, as Bill was bringing up, I was the co-founder of Encari. It's pretty recently, just a couple weeks ago, we announced my departure from there. Now, of course, I'm back to my old hat here of being the president of Sphere, which has been about 7 years in length. The clientele of Sphere and Encari represents about 25%. This is a hard number to somewhat quantify, but we use it to say 25% of the North American bulk electric system. And the way we quantified that was how much in megawatts of control these entities had underneath their discretion. So it wasn't by power line mile. I mean, there's just a lot of ways you can try to do analogies on it, but that's what we used here. Power, not people. Right. So, and that could be interesting. That's the other thing that's happened over the past 15 years with automation is, the number of people controlling a very specific amount of power has dwindled quite a bit with our automation that we've been throwing out. The assets that we've included in this that have been identified as critical by our clients: generation, multiple fuel sources. So we've been to hydro facilities, we've been to coal-fired plants. We've been to natural gas, kerosene run. We have not been to any nuclear facilities as it is right now. That initially in the CIP standards was not covered as one of the as identifiable as a critical asset, which now has been included. The critical cyber assets that we've seen have been all across the board, and we've worked with entities to help them identify what they have as critical cyber assets by using a selection criteria as far as what is essential to the reliable operation of the critical asset. That's what it's defined as in CIP 002, Requirement 3, when you identify your critical cyber assets, as well as investigation of how that cyber asset communicates. With the current version of the CIP standards, every entity is limited by only having to select cyber assets as being critical underneath the standards if it communicates as a OSI Layer 3 communication protocol or higher. Now, that affected some of our clients in some very odd ways, such as we had some clients that had Novell IPX. So now all of a sudden you have this Layer 3 protocol that now you really have to protect pursuant to the standards, but it wasn't necessarily underneath the same threat vector as what we were concerned with internet access to the assets. But flip side, you had control systems that were being managed by Modbus or DMP or other types of closed circuit communication protocols like Bailey LoopNet. I mean, there's just a lot of these that exist in that InfoNet standard. That's another one that weren't affected by them being identified as critical cyber assets because they don't communicate using a Layer 3 protocol either locally or outside of its electronic security perimeter, which later, of course, is really going to be a firewall providing a logical separation between the business network and the control network. Another big touch point, of course, are those ESPs and our remote vendor access. Very important because typically when a utility purchases a control system, they purchase along with that a support agreement to allow for continued access by that vendor. That reality is because we don't have enough people supporting these systems. There's not enough background or education for the knowledge that's necessary to be able to support the systems that are deployed. So you have to allow for that remote continued access to a system, which that leads to absolutely security ramifications of allowing that. And furthermore, there have been changes in CIP 005, as I was saying before, -4, that's up for industry ballot right now. Operational security is within the CIP standards as well, really addressed in 001, 03, and 04. 001 talks about sabotage reporting and understanding how to talk to the FBI. 03 talks about developing policies and procedures for all the remaining CIP standards, as well as having an information protection program in the environment and strong change controls for change management. And then 004 really starts talking about personnel security and ensuring that there's background checks that are performed, and any modifications or any type of new personnel that are granted access or any type of technical modification that happens in the environment has gone through an authorization and approval process. And then we have physical security at the end, which, the reflection over the past 5 years working with electric utilities solely on the CIP standards, it was a very welcome. We were very welcomed by this. The fact of how much physical security and cybersecurity started to work together within environments. That typically had been a national security or a militaristic point of view to even be doing that. Now to see that physical security or corporate security was working with cybersecurity representatives together was invaluable. And a lot of environments didn't recognize at first that the cybersecurity standards, the CIP standards, applied to physical security cyber assets as well. So we would commonly see physical security systems running on Windows XP that hadn't been patched for years, for instance, that are handling the door-held open alarms, or that are handling the swing arm gates at a facility, or that are running the cameras that are possibly even IP-driven cameras versus just being hardwired traditional closed-circuit television cameras. So the challenges I want to cover, and again, feel free to ask questions. I'm certain there's many of them. I had to pick my potpourri of challenges that I thought were interesting. There are many other ones. But I'm going to go through these individually. The first one is just talking about the NERC CIP requirements and how they can bind you. Idaho National Laboratory and some of the initial control system security program ran into a bit of an upheaval as they had the recommendations of having canaries located within the control systems to be able to identify potential anomalous traffic that's not destined for a real system. And as soon as you do that, if you add a new cyber asset inside the ESP, it's now bound by NERC CIP. So that means we have to understand default user accounts. We have to be able to run antivirus on it, which then that moved into a bit painful moment just right there, having to deal with that. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about shared infrastructure. How massive is this network? We went into several municipalities that their generation and transmission control network also currently managed their freshwater supply system and was being added on to manage their wastewater supply system within the facility. The exact same control network, control system software that was put in by, in this case, a Russian company that was no longer in existence anymore that couldn't support them. So you can see all sorts of different situations as you look at some of the documented infrastructure. And that's if it's documented. You can run into right away just trying to understand what cyber assets are in the environment, what's running, what's been operationally configured, and we'll talk through that. So I'm going to go through these individually. I'm not going to cover them anymore right now, but we'll hit them slide by slide. So this first bounded component is just some of the compliance challenges you can run into. So right now, being the first year and a half after the CIP standards have hit a deadline, so the CIP standards were rolled out incrementally, where you had to comply by the first 13 and the subsequent 28 a year later. And the first 13 for your most, typically your largest electric utilities, were really only operational driven. They were personnel background checks. They were assigning a cybersecurity policy maker, an accountable representative within the organization. The additional 28 that we've been hitting since essentially July of 2009, and now the audible compliance deadline of July of 2010, that becomes interesting because now auditors include this in their reviews. The actual CIP auditors from the regions include technical requirements in their reviews. Those weren't part of their reviews to begin with. As these technical requirements are being reviewed, industry is becoming a little bit more aware of what their interpretation was of the CIP standards versus what the auditor's interpretation has been potentially all along. But with that is also coming up this vulnerability assessment process that's required on an annual basis. And we have just been getting requests over this past year to start performing these. With that comes its own challenges. Right? Some of the questions are, well, how do you do this vulnerability assessment process, such as finding out what ports and services are running on a system, what are required for normal and emergency operations, what user accounts are necessary, what default accounts are in the system, at all layers, whether it's in the BIOS, whether it's in the operating system, whether it's in the applications that are running on that system. What was the interpretation of the client, whether they even thought about thinking about BIOS passwords, firmware passwords that are in systems? Did they even realize that those were even there? In a lot of situations, they didn't. But when you do this vulnerability assessment, you first have to ask the question, am I going to be running or assessing what is running on these systems by using tools that are within the operating system, or am I going to use some additional piece of software or logic to scan remotely and find out what is running on the system? We, Encari Sphere, myself, I don't want to do any scanning. That's going to be a nightmare. It's going to create problems. It's going to do a denial of service event. Most likely it's going to consume all the network bandwidth, specifically at generating facilities. It can't handle it. I don't want to use automated tools in a lot of scenarios. It's just too concerning, especially to do automated tools on a live network. Now, if there is a test environment that I can use, great, that's fantastic. But of course, as we've seen, as part of the standards, your test environment is supposed to sufficiently duplicate or mimic the production environment. But can it truly mimic and duplicate the production environment? Well, I don't see any of our clients with a test generating facility. Very good question. So the question is it about automated tools when I say automated tools, is it something that's actively probing or passively collecting? And it depends. For what I'm going to bring up as a point here, as soon as I connect something to the network, it now has to be reviewed as being a cyber asset inside the ESP. And if it can be programmed with an IP address, well, now it depends on that client's interpretation of how they've identified whether something has a routable protocol associated with it. Most clients have interpreted the fact that the routable protocol is disabled but not programmed or not actually operational, that it's not going to be a critical cyber asset. Just the fact that it can doesn't mean that it has to be critical. But as soon as I plug something else in to start collecting, I at least have to go through that process to find out what have I plugged in and have I affected the security controls of everything else that's in this environment. So you get bound by NERC CIP. And that's where we do not like at all putting in our own devices within networks. We always, if we get to the point that a client wants us to add an additional scanning device, either for passive data collection off the wire or for active collection where we have to ask devices about their current security state, we ask for our clients to configure the environment and then we use their systems. In no way do we want to go through that process. Because then if we take it offline, now we have to go through the decommissioning procedures that are in 007, and then we have to understand their policy procedures around that, and it becomes a real mess. We see a lot of organizations most likely becoming non-compliant this year just because they're not correctly doing their vulnerability assessment, and some third party is connecting widgets or devices into their environment that shouldn't be there. So the question is, how are they becoming non-compliant? And is it around the region should be doing the audits, but now an entity can be doing their own pre-audits? What the region typically does is they're going to be looking at paperwork and documentation trails and evidence of compliance, but not necessarily an active vulnerability assessment or a true technical vulnerability assessment. They look to the asset owner to do that vulnerability assessment, and then the region looks at the evidence that you've done that vulnerability assessment. So what I'm talking to here is the actual vulnerability assessment process, this process that the asset owner is responsible for, that the region will then audit, if you can follow that trail. That second bullet there, the integrating intrusion detection sensors, I already talked to that. I mean, the challenge is whenever you integrate something, it has to have security controls as prescribed by CIP 007, 008, all of the technical controls that need to be in place for incident response, antivirus, malware detection capabilities, default user accounts being disabled. And many times, this is where our clients and electric utilities cannot deploy network appliances. They can't do it because they can't run these types of services. So we've seen time and time again, for instance, where entities that offer a security information and event management tool where it is an appliance and it can't run antivirus, the entity does not want to file a technical feasibility exception with NERC, so they would rather purchase ArcSight that they can install on a Windows platform that they can then run antivirus on. So there's a big push to potentially run these other operating systems and not buy appliances. So that's where there's some challenges on how do you integrate these additional systems. And as soon as you integrate something else that can have an IP address on it, or that does have an IP address on it, now it's bound by NERC CIP, how you have to maintain it and monitor it, even though it's a security device. So we're looking at an IDS being a security device, but we have to bind it by being a cyber asset inside the ESP, even though it's non-critical. It may be identified critical depending on the operation. The other piece is this requirement around antivirus. It's still a bit of a mess as we look at it. The NERC CIP standards, as they were initially drafted and updated from Urgent Action 1200, were really only written to service control centers. They were then ported over to work in substation environments and to also work in our generating facilities. But in no way was it ever thought that you could install antivirus on a PLC. And as we look at some of the security controls and requirements that you have in generating facilities and substations, where we even have RTUs as well, some of these requirements just don't make sense. And there may be other ways that you want to deploy them. And that's when, as we move to these modifications, either from the guidance from FERC Order 706 or additional industry comments or reviews, how we're changing them with version 4 of the CIP standards. So the point out of this is you don't want to affect the environment to be able to do a security analysis or to be able to have better security controls. Because as soon as you do, those devices are bound by NERC CIP themselves. It seems a bit of an oxymoron that you have to get into that situation, but it is a reality. The next piece you'll run into, well, I personally, I've had to wear the knee pads. It's a lot easier at a control center going around trying to find network cabling than it is at a generating facility, or to hear the nice hum as you're at a 345 kV substation, just be concerned about why your hair is standing, or what hair I have left anyway. But nonetheless, as you start discovering what is within this network, this is where you find out how much shared infrastructure there really is. Where does that routable protocol go? And notice again, it stops as soon as we leave. As soon as we have a device that goes from routable to non-routable, as soon as we have a device that goes from OSI layer 3 to OSI layer 2, everything on the other side of that is not bound by NERC CIP. We saw a lot of entities just putting in little OSI layer 3 to layer 2 bridges, just so that they can separate off all those cyber assets to not be bound by NERC CIP. And that happens in a lot of scenarios. The reality is, what could you do anyway? A lot of our front ends, let's say at a control center that talk out in the field, they talk layer 2 out to field devices, not layer 3. It depends on the size of the organization, whether they've updated already to a layer 3 communication protocol or not to talk to the field. But that would be a device where it's a critical cyber asset. It has layer 3 on one side, layer 2 on the other, but everything else on the other side is not bound by NERC CIP. But right away, you may see certain areas that have already done updates because they want to have ease of maintenance, ease of support. They have a limited budget for personnel and staff. They want to use the same people that maintain the city networks, the traditional IT networks, to be able to maintain the control system. So they've merged all the networks together. Now, when I say merge, they then have a firewall typically between the business network and the control network. But then the question is, logically, how is that firewall configured? Is it truly reduced down to the IP address sets, the communication protocols that are really necessary? For NERC CIP, it would be required, but a lot of your municipalities, as they went through their critical asset selection criteria for version 1, version 2, and version 3, were able to evade having any of their assets identified as critical. You run into challenges with multi-owned facilities. So let's say if you happen to have here's a split hydro facility. There was two owners. One owner owns head in, one owner owns a downstream facility, but they actually have a shared control system between the two owners that has shared logic between the two as it was initially built. And that's where you then have to manage delegation of cybersecurity controls between these two separate physically administrative domains. I mean, that's the university challenge. Right? I mean, that's the challenge we get into of trying to manage the individual control domains. That's the governmental challenge we have as well. And physical site usage. It's not uncommon we will go to a substation and part of the microwave tower has been leased out for cellular communications. So now physical security becomes a challenge for that environment where there's multiple asset owners that can actually access that system and gain access to some of their devices maybe in that same physical security zone. So that leads into a real nightmare in trying to manage personnel security situations. We even have one facility that this one wasn't bound by being a critical asset, but because of their relationship with the local municipality and the citizens of the municipality, they just allowed the residents that were fishing there to be able to use their bathroom at the hydro facility. You just definitely don't necessarily know what you're going to get into. Or even just static keys that have been used for a physical lock that just have been around for a substantial period of time. No different than what we run into with certificates today, where a certificate has been running for a substantial period of time and everybody forgets about the expiration date of when that certificate becomes invalidated. Yep. So the question is around the shared infrastructure. When you move into a compliance challenge, who is accountable for the compliance of those requirements? You are allowed with NERC, they actually have a filing process where you can become a JRO, a joint registration, with two different entities or multiple entities, where you can delegate what requirements each entity is going to be responsible for, or if there's going to be joint responsibility or not. And that's what you need to do as part of registration. So that's the technicalities of managing it. When you get to truly managing cybersecurity or physical security, that's where it becomes much more difficult. Where luckily in these instances so far, those assets were not identified as being critical in our situation. Where we have seen the joint challenges is where I own generation and you own transmission. That happens all the time. So the substation that's right outside of my facility is owned by by the transmission provider. I own the generator. We have a dependency between the two of us. I've identified myself as a critical asset. You, as being the transmission provider, better be a critical asset as well. So that's where it starts. And then anything else further as far as what kind of cybersecurity controls the transmission provider selected versus what I selected as the generation owner, there really is no communication between the two, and no requirement for communication. If something were identified where you enacted your incident response plan and had to notify NERC or the DOE, well, then I would hope that would be managed by then notifying the generation owner or vice versa if something were to happen. But there's no requirement for the standards for additional communication between the two.
All right, thank you.
But the point here is how expansive the boundaries are, and they're not stopping; they're growing. The interconnections are becoming even more massive. It's not. We're automating more. We're making more network connections. We're making more wireless connections, wired connections. We're allowing more trust. Independent system operators are controlling more and more of grid assets, transmission, and generation. So as you look at some of the Cal ISO, Midwest ISO, PJM, and those types of organizations are starting to control directly more and more assets, so they're becoming much more expansive. Undocumented or poorly documented systems. Reality is cyber's everywhere. It's everywhere that nobody thought that it was. When you have to walk around a generating facility just to find all the cyber components, the first thing we do is try to look at as-built drawings. Those were last updated years ago. They don't show the most recent emission systems that was put in, or high-pressure water injection system. Again, that's free for emissions. Oddly enough, a lot of the emission systems that are put in over the past 5 to 6 years. That typically, as we'll get to a little bit later on, can lead to an additional generator trip that wasn't documented. May have been missed in an environment where that system is now on an unprotected network and it needs to be protected. Physical security systems not being properly maintained in a lot of situations. But, as we see, there's a strong dependency between cybersecurity and physical security. However, do we really have that as we look at Stuxnet and some of our conversations earlier this morning that we were having? But if you're going to allow somebody to plug in a USB flash drive, and the current CIP standards don't have anything around that type of restriction on somebody just plugging in that device. Now, as far as what they do with it, there may be additional restrictions. You may be able to say that it's updating software in some regards, that you need to go through SIP 007 R1 test procedures, but that would be a real strong, loose association to try to tie that together. And so far, the audits have not been including that. Literally dangling network switches and wireless access points that have been left behind. Additional network connections, bridging different networks together, where there wasn't the reality of this switch was actually on the business network and this other switch was on the control network, and now they're bridged together between the two. Physical network cards. We ran into one situation where a network card was actually added to the SCADA server at a generating facility just so that they could have a printer, because they didn't have any control over the network devices. A different entity had control over that. They did have control over the physical server, so they put a network card in it, enabled routing and remote access in this Windows 2000 server, and then attached the printer to that network card so they could print locally within the plant. Vendor backdoor networks and user accounts. We've seen PECs, little GE PEC units at several natural gas facilities, where a bolt-on wireless access point was added just for remote maintenance and support of the system when somebody comes back. Now, the way they secured that was they put a physical key lock to then be able to turn network connection off, network connection on, network connection off. But very easily, actually in this case, they never informed the asset owner that they added this. So this asset owner was then asking us, what is this device that has now been added? So then we had to open it up and find out that there was an additional access point that had been put in, and that connectivity was then in place once that lock was then turned. So literally, vendor backdoor networks added into certain environments. Wire traces passing through odd locations. One facility, and again just focusing on generating facilities right now, they had a snowblower room, where essentially this is where they would park their snowblower at the facility, but it was the same place where all the network cables intermingled at the location for the control network. So the point is that cyber asset discovery is mandatory. You have to know the environment, and it is not easy. Cyber assets are everywhere. And we were in one location, network cables just running through graded flooring for 10 floors, 12 floors, 15 floors, depending on how high the facility is. And then little additional 8-port to 4-port industrial-grade network switches added throughout the entire plant, just so somebody can make control modifications anywhere without the plant.
Could you, on your previous slide, it said automated tools not allowed. And so I'll just give you where I'm coming from. It's fantastic that you're giving all these examples of troubles, right? And unfortunately, maybe a lot of where we are now is troubles. So I'm thinking about the path forward and the scalability as in the next version of NERC CIP, when many more things are going to become at least medium critical assets. I'm thinking about how we're going to scale to actually be able to do all these audits. And so I keep seeing indications that we're not going to be able to use automated tools. So I want your comment on that in general, and specifically, what did you mean here?
All right, very good question. So throughout here, when I'm talking about automated tools, the struggle that we run into and our clients run into is they may make the request, hey, come and run GFI LandGuard or Nessus or some other type of collection script in their environment without allowing us to go through any type of sufficient testing in their environment to find out what the ramifications could be. So we tell them, no, we're not going to do it unless you pay us twice the money what we have so we can have time to test it first, because we're not just going to come in blindly and do this. So if we could get into an environment where we have latch-based applications that can sit there that allow us to pull them, where we know those environments have already been tested, where we know this application works, and it's not going to create a denial of service event, because that's our most concern. That as we pull, we're going to create that DOS event for some kind of communication flow that needs to be there in the control system, or it's going to trip the unit. I look at it in one place, just when we were doing physical discovery, they had one of their vibration monitors. It was an older one. They opened it, just swung it out so we could see the back, and one of the cables came disconnected. Well, that was its data point cable. So now all of a sudden the control system says, hey, I don't have that information anymore. It had been programmed, so if it didn't get that data point, it tripped the unit. Now in this case, it just happened to be in spinning reserve, and that's the only unit I've ever tripped from a generation standpoint as we've been doing these assessments. But point being, that's been the time over time again. If we can't get pulled information through and we were to saturate the network, well then it's going to end up doing something to the unit. So if we can have something that we know has been regression tested in this specific environment or works on a specific platform, or it's not going to have this type of challenges, then automated tools would be fantastic, and it would make our lives much better. The only place where we have been successful in rolling out automated tools, so you know what, I should have put an asterisk on here as we said this. We've been very successful at control centers because the value of a control center environment is that we typically have an EMS A, B, C, and even D system that we can operate with. So A and B, A is your primary, B is your secondary at the primary location, C is your tertiary at a secondary location, and D is your test system that you have in place. You might even have an E system if you happen to have a quality assurance system and then a test system beyond that. We have performed active assessments against the B and C system, the non-active systems, while the A is active. And we actually, in environments, have set up Nessus with Bandolier running, Digital Bonds Bandolier project, where we do daily assessments of the C system and its current security state of what ports and services, what user accounts, which is the requirement of CIP 007R1 having test procedures. So that's one of our test procedures we do, and it's just performed daily. And we get those results back, and that's automated in nature. So you can do it, but you just want to make sure that it's been regression tested in that environment. Absolutely, I agree. For scalability, we have to be able to do that. And our challenge at the generating facilities is every environment is really unique until you get in those PECs. When you have some of those pre-built solutions from some of the vendors, a lot of those are very similar in nature. And that leads to some security concerns. So they become too similar in nature. Right? I mean, addressing is the same in all environments, for instance. But nonetheless, that's where you can have that type of economies of scale. Wireless, well, I'll talk about wireless in a moment, but we see so many break-fix scenarios that occur. A physical cable breaks, and wireless just gets added to an environment. And the vendor says it's secure, it's 900 megahertz wireless, it's quote-unquote secure. And you just go and buy the exact same vendor's hardware, place it within the general proximity of where that other wireless antenna is, and you're going to be able, it demodulates and decodes just for you. So their security was in a proprietary modulation scheme, so the security wasn't there at all. But pointedly, those things happen without updating the documentation. So you have to do a wireless analysis of the environment. All right. Triggering mechanisms can be located in different security contexts. It's not uncommon that we would find vibration monitoring systems that were located on the business network. So initially, as they were on the business network, you're able to do your vibration monitoring at a generating facility. It doesn't have any trips enabled. It's just there as a validation that the system is operating correctly, and then all of a sudden a trip is then programmed in. And now it can trip the unit, but it's still located in the wrong security context, the wrong network. We've seen that with emission systems. We've also seen that with AI systems located in the wrong security context. Other areas that really require additional review on triggering back to security context is all scripting that we've seen for at control systems, specifically for blackstart operations and load balancing, where those scripts may then be stored in locations outside of the control network on a business network server that everybody has access to, or more people have access to than should have access in that environment. So pointedly, this is just where engineering and cyber need to talk to each other so that they understand where data is being stored whenever they use any of the operational mechanisms that are available to them. Information protection. One of the CIP standards, actually two of them, in CIP 003, talks about any lists that are created as part of the standard, such as your list of critical assets, your list of critical cyber assets, your security configuration documents, have to go through a list of who the authorizers are who grant access to the information. Doesn't necessarily require you to keep a list of who has access to the information, just who the authorizers are. That's an oddity right now anyway, just the current information protection requirements. But the things that we've been seeing here is where you've now collected all this information about the security architecture, your design, your most critical assets, your most critical cyber assets, and now that information is then outsourced to some third party's document management system. Or the security event monitoring has been outsourced to a third party without doing sufficient review of the skill sets of that third party's monitoring capabilities. We've seen a situation where all that critical documentation then is just transmitted in the clear across the internet, or in the clear across the business network, or on a backup tape from the facility that then is transmitted physically somewhere else outside of the physical security of that organization. And then even moving into individual electric utility trucks and operations and laptops that are used by field techs. I mean, the types of control that you have from those field tech systems, I mean, you're going to have the control software on it. You're going to have the passwords on it. You're going to have, Schneider Electric 5 years ago made available their Bluetooth-enabled transformers. I mean, that's a great technology. It's from the standpoint of now you don't have to climb a pole. I mean, I would appreciate that. But Bluetooth has its own security challenges that you get into. But the point I'm talking about here is just protecting data at rest and knowing where it is. It's a simple challenge that we've had in all contexts, not just electric utilities. But here, it could, now you can go and focus on stealing a laptop from a physical technician's truck and then have additional control capabilities of assets within that general area. Default settings. There are infinite. And even if you want to try to change the default settings of a device, it's not uncommon that if we've worked with vendors, they will inform us that they will change back the system to its default settings if they're ever called in to do troubleshooting. So if you try to add additional security controls, if you try to change default passwords, they will reset them during a troubleshooting exercise. Now, that's not necessarily fully a cybersecurity risk as long as you're aware of it. Maybe you reduce your connectivity at that point in time when that type of troubleshooting is occurring. But the reality is you have to know, first, find out those default settings even exist, which a lot of organizations don't even know that to begin with, and then try to disable them if a vendor will allow you to do it. Lots of systems have additional services that you can't disable. Maybe you can't turn off Telnet. Maybe you can't disable the infrared port that's directly on a device. Maybe you cannot disable wireless. Maybe you didn't even know that you purchased a bunch of wind turbines that had 802.11 connectivity on the circuitry that was in part of the supply chain process. That was announced actually a year ago by Jason Larson of Idaho National Laboratory at the SAN SCADA Summit. Typically, of course, our wind turbines are not going to be critical assets, though, for the bulk electric system. Except, potentially, down where you have a guarantee where there may be wind flow. Oh, the middle point there is talking about, again, our intelligent electronic devices typically just don't generate security events. So what we've been trying to do from our, the ARC sites, the Nitros, the other security logging vendors have been developing bolt-on, Tofino, bolt-on solutions to then be able to generate security events based upon network transmissions that are occurring. Now that's an additional cyber asset you then have to maintain and support. So there's a cost-benefit understanding there from a procedural and updating the system and security validation and everything else you have to deal with by it being a cyber asset within the ESP. But we need to have security events coming from our intelligent electronic devices. And we need a standard. The standard is much broader than just control systems. I mean, we don't even have a standard in traditional business security. I mean, that's why these SIM vendors like an ArcSight or, well, Cisco Mars for a while until it became somewhat defunct, have had a market. We do not have a standard logging format. We have 8 levels of syslog, but we don't have some standard context that we can use. We went through a lot of work on smart meters to develop some standard logging formats. We still have all these other logical devices where we don't have it. We tried to bolt on, let's say, within Industrial Defender's Guardian product, where we can now protect assets at a substation, where you force all the communication through this centralized node so it can generate events of interest for you. But what about all the other devices that we need to be able to support at a generating facility? So this one talks a little bit, I say smart grid, and that's somewhat unfair. I mean, first of all, I don't even like the phrase smart grid because we already have a smart grid. We're just making it smarter, right? I mean, we're just pushing it out to the edge a bit more. But the point that I want to make here is, as it is right now, NERC CIP is for the bulk electric system. NERC CIP does not fall underneath and cover distribution automation because typically it's going to be underneath 100 kV. So we do have a dichotomy there. Now, will that change? It's been discussed for a while that it will be changing. We have the NISTR. We have a lot of other things. We have NERC CIP-like things coming in, but then, of course, we have NIST over here and how all these things sort of merge together as we're trying to work forward with what these regulations are going to be in the future. But the point that I wanted to make here is, as we have smarter applications at the edge, it's not just the electric utilities that are making it smarter. I mean, we've already had the challenges of, and there's a lot of manufacturing facilities that also have generators that when they aren't using that generation, they then pump it into the power grid to be able to sell those additional spare cycles. What are their security controls? Or what are the security controls that are going to go in place as people automate their homes? Or, as the example here, the MGM City Center in Las Vegas, where they're going to have 22,000 Zigbee devices deployed in that entire facility. Every single hotel room is going to have Zigbee automated controls. So what kind of security is built into that? I'm also an instructor for the SAN Institute in their Security 617 course, which is their wireless security course that Joshua Wright wrote from Inguardians. And more recently, we've added that course Zigbee. And what Josh wrote, essentially, as part of that course as well, and you can download the source code from Google Code, but you can go to killerb.googlecode.com, and he's updated and modified the B operating system and a couple of different Zigbee devices to serve as a little IMAP scanner, a peering, partnering device, a vulnerability scanner, a code injection, payload injection capability, all sorts of little features that have been added to it. And when we look at Zigbee security, there's been a lot of changes occur over the past several years with this Trust Center push and Zigbee Pro versus traditional Zigbee. But as we move to wireless at the edge and being able to control more and more devices at the edge, ultimately, if you can control multiple homes, you can have the same kind of impact as controlling multiple, small part of the bulk electric system. If you can control a lot of the load and then start cycling it in some way in a similar style. So we're going to automate electric utilities at the edge like we have been and as we are doing with our smart meters, but there's already a push, Insteon, X10, everything else, Zigbee at the edge already in residential and businesses. That's not being secured properly. It will only continue to grow. So that leads into these communication back channels that may exist. First one is just in wide area connectivity. The communications between generation and substation, whether it's going across microwave towers or just traditional GSM, potentially using even the older A51 cipher that was recently broken in December of last year. Well, it's been broken for a while, but then the hashing table became publicly available. Communications off to our independent system operators. Remote support, I talked about that already. So the point is the expansive trust network that's growing as time continues. The unknown communication channels between our hosts. And that's one thing where there was a pretty slick little application written by Idaho National Laboratory to do fingerprinting of communication on a control network, which you want to know what is there, how it talks, and then look for anomalies from that. Virtualized environments. It was 2 years ago, I took an entire control center and put it on a USB stick. We're going to have virtual control centers. Moving forward, we're most likely even going to have control centers in the cloud. As odd as that sounds, municipalities will be required to do it because they won't be able to support it. But potentially that could lead to, what if we had and this is a conversation we were having on the side earlier, what if we had a government-controlled or a centralized secured or some mechanism where we had a protected cloud that applications like this could work inside, and then they controlled physical assets or physical controllers within the location at the edge. Virtualization is already there. We already have virtualized control systems. That's been happening for several years already. That leads to other security risks where did that organization actually identify the host operating system as being a critical cyber asset, or not. System administration I already talked to, some of the challenges there of connectivity where you may not know that exists. We've seen KVMs attached to the wrong networks, UPSs attached to the wrong networks, where they're attached to business networks. So you have a UPS that's powering critical cyber assets within the ESP, but the network management of that UPS is on the business network. Critical cyber assets communication across phone lines within the facility, because it's still going across Category 3 cabling within the generating facility. And again, wireless being everywhere. So as we look at all this, a lot of this is that bolted-on technology. That's what led us into a lot of these situations. We've updated systems over the past several years. We've added additional features because of a break-fix scenario or because of wanting to add in maybe for emissions. Whether maybe it's a communication bridge where we bridge a protocol into 900 megahertz and we convert it from Modbus to Ethernet over TCP because it's easier to support. We can purchase an additional device that supports that can manage this network cheaper than the traditional vendor solution that uses a proprietary protocol. But then again, the point here is that we have to contain our control networks. And then we move into our operational dependencies just to be able to have the system work. It's not uncommon that you'll find crane lifts at generating facilities that are wirelessly controlled over 900 megahertz. It's not uncommon that you'll find laser-guided or wireless control coal haulers or locomotives at a facility. Another dependency, of course, is just the energy markets. If the energy markets get disrupted, then you're not going to be able to pass through what your scheduled output is going to be from one day to the next, so you're not going to be operational the next day, at least from a profit standpoint, unless the government sets in and forces you to operate even though you haven't sold your energy. So operational dependency are very, very important to understand, and the security configurations around them. So the recommendations out of all this, the first one here is just we need to have, or the requirements of having some kind of a better understanding between the operational underpinnings of a facility, generating facility, and the technical security controls that are put in place and the technical automation that we've put in place. So if something that's been programmed logically fails, we can still flip back to manual operating procedures if we need to. I felt personally, as an example of another control system, the Waterworks Department in the city of Chicago, I successfully was able to get them to add in manually operated pumps in case their automated control system failed. That was not part of their original schematic, and then they added that in the last minute. So same thing holds true here. If something were to happen, we may not fall back to manual, we may be able to go back to some type of lower automation. And thinking about that type of incident response procedure is ultimately important because it's not a matter of when an event's going to happen, it's a matter of if. Or a matter of if an event's going to happen, it's a matter of when. I recommend right now no traditional wireless communication for all environments. Microwave, yep, it's still going to be there. Cellular, it's going to be there. But if you can get away with it and go with fiber, wireless doesn't have boundaries. It's too many attacks are happening right now in the wireless space because it's hard to associate attribution back to the original individual that created the attack. No permanent OSI layer 1 inbound. Don't allow layer 1 inbound. Restrict what is allowed to come into a facility. Only allow outbound at layer 1. Then you don't have to worry about layer 3, layer 4 misconfigurations within a firewall. Profiling your network traffic immediately. Reviewing all those scripts that I talked about before and reviewing all the generation trips that have been put in place so that you understand in your environment what's active and what's been configured so you have the right systems protected. And then, more importantly right now, it seems to be monitor all the other activity that's going on in control networks, such as automobile CAN communications, which seem to be a target of control systems because it's easy to procure them. It's easy for a university and some of the research scientists there, such as the University of Washington and San Diego and South Carolina and Rutgers, to be able to do this analysis on an automobile because it's already pre-built. But that type of study is going to lower the bar, and the tools that are generated is going to lower the barrier to entry into attacking and understanding control networks on all verticals, including ours being electric utilities. So that's why that research paper that came out in May and August was of great interest to myself individually, because it was the first very directed, being CarShark as an application to be able to control components of an automobile control network. And the final point there is to make sure to start using our data historians for situational awareness and operational security, because we have an amazing amount of information there. And I know I had the conversation earlier this morning that we've started to do that, and that's great. And we have to continue, because that's operational data that most businesses do not have, that we can really leverage to our environment to understand. We just have to correlate that to cyber and physical activity at that point in time. And a lot with the CIP standards, they should be having cyber logs. The challenge is that most environments actually don't centralize them, and they require an individual to manually go out to each one of the cyber devices to review their logs manually, as it is this point in time, because it was too costly to implement a centralized tool. All right. That was everything I had.
Thanks very much, Matt. We'd like to thank you. It was a great talk. And we do have time for some questions, both here physically in the audience and online. So is there anyone that would like to start in this room? Please come up to a mic if you could. I see we've got some people coming up. And then in a minute, I'll switch over to anyone online.
Matt, you said something interesting that I wanted you to elaborate on, is that you've seen virtualization increasing over the past 2 years in the utilities. I found that in the utilities that we've talked to, none of them either will admit they have virtualization or know that they have virtualization. Can you perhaps give some examples of where you've seen virtualization in the control centers?
Absolutely. So I'll focus on the control centers. It is happening at generating facilities as well, as vendors are allowing their PLCs to be virtualized on their own, so most asset owners may not even know that they're doing it, because it becomes easier to update the system. But what I've been seeing at control centers, one where they know and one where they don't know. Where they know is where they've actually taken their energy management system and they virtualized the whole thing on, let's say, VMware, for instance. That's happened in a lot of different environments, because it reduces down support costs from the standpoint of, if I want to ensure that I can mimic the environment that's in operations and test, I just have to copy a file over. It becomes a lot easier to support and maintain. Now, that easeability leads to security risks, virtualized security risks, portability of the image security risks. The area where entities don't know that they're virtualizing and they're doing it is, I call storage area networks virtualization. It's virtual storage. And I've seen storage area networks that cross the demarcs of internet-facing, business-facing, and control network-facing. So a storage area network that has a DMZ, internet-facing server, using it to store data, business network storing data, control system storing data for its storing, all in the same spot.
So I think we have an online question. Is that right? You're going to ask it. Okay, I didn't know if you're going to patch them in or you're going to ask it.
The question was, when you speak about wireless, did you mean no wireless at all or just at the core?
The more that you can move away from boundaryless solutions like wireless, I think the better off you're going to be in the future. The reality is, let's say if you use traditional microwave technology, those frequencies that you transmitted on were registered with the FCC, and that's public information. So I can pull that up on any electric utility to find out what your frequencies are you're transmitting on. If you're using wireless for any part of control right now, and I know it's in a lot of areas for Zigbee, I know we see it for a lot of our natural gas pipelines, I know we have it for cellular all over the place, but with the type of activity that's occurring right now, arbitrary injects could occur on that wireless communication channel that could be at risk. And I mean, I know we use wireless in our control networks for the OnStar system, and so there's just a lot of things that are going on right now research-wise wirelessly, and the challenge is attribution. Can you truly find out who did that wireless inject when it happens? Because you can have an incredible distance associated with it as well. So I recommend trying to find ways for your most critical of components to not have wireless. That may be only at the core, or it may be at other places as well.
So, you mentioned information sharing to third party of the possible threat. Why do organizations normally share this information to third parties? Is it because of mistakes, or is there business cases?
So the information protection slide,
yeah,
the sharing of information, it's shared for a multitude of reasons. One, it might be shared with us as a contractor that comes in, and so that could be one reason. That might be, with us, we try to always stop them before they would share it in an insecure manner, knowing that that was quite commonplace. Another reason could just be lack of understanding of the sensitivity of the information that they're sharing. So maybe it's not properly labeled or classified. It could be historical in nature, where the documents weren't classified 3 years ago because of NERC CIP, and now they are. And it could be because in this space there's a lot of contractors having to do a lot of the field work, and that's how a new gem plant's built. That's how it's operated in a lot of scenarios, is that it's a contractor driven. So those documents get passed all over the place, and then you move to outsourcing of outsourcing of outsourcing. Let's say for some of our energy management systems, where then all of a sudden a programmer then is located in other areas that you had no idea where they were coming from, although you thought they went through a background check by that entity, but they didn't put them through it. So then documents get exposed that way. There's just a multitude of ways that it can happen.
So the kind of information that you don't want to share, so is that configuration and the structure of your network, password, or what kind of information is it critical?
That would be one piece. Anything that gives me a roadmap, anything that gives me ideas of what you're doing. I mean, you shouldn't even share your incident response procedures either, right? So, whenever you think about attacks, whether they're physical or cyber, my attack may be the attack itself, or it may be me understanding what your response is going to be, so then I'll do the other attack after you respond, right? So, and for NERC CIP, there are very specific types of documents identified that it says at a minimum shall protect. So of course you can go above and beyond. But network design, security controls, incident response plans, your list of critical assets, critical cyber assets, that'd be a quick start.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
So we have time for just one very quick question and answer, and then I'm told we have to wrap it up.
Okay.
Matt, I like what you said about having the ability to do manual control. I guess my question is we have to balance the security versus the cost of the security, and certainly some protection means are cost effective, but others will spend a lot of money and won't gain a lot. Maybe part of the solution is to say, well, let's have the ability to just manually control a lot of things if we need to, so if there is some security violation, we've got a backup plan. Just your thoughts on that.
I think that sounds tremendous. My concern is we have to document that manual control, and the reality is right now, over the next 3 to 5 years, the people that know how to do it are going to leave the companies. They're going to retire. Or, well, maybe they'll become a consultant. Good point. But and then they'll get paid that much more, whatever it may be. But I think it's going to be a combination of understanding how to operate manually, and I also think we're going to have to move to more of an islanded approach in certain areas with more massive interconnectivity. In case a fault occurs, it gets contained.
Okay, so I think we have to call it a day. That was a fantastic presentation. I guess there were more challenges and problems from a practical point of view than solutions, but that's very useful to us as well as we think about how to move forward. So I'd like to ask everyone again to thank Matt and thank people online. And we will have our next one of these online presentations next month. I think that is on November 5, and it will be in conjunction with a NISTer all-day event going on here. So if you're interested in coming to that, or our TCIPG industry meeting, which is that week as well, just send us an email. Thanks very much.
Thank you.